What if I told you that a single photograph could shatter everything we thought we knew about freedom in post-Civil War America? What if behind the innocent faces of children lay one of the most disturbing secrets of the Reconstruction era? What if the very image meant to showcase a family's prosperity instead became evidence of one of the most shameful chapters in American history? In 1882, 17 years after the official end of slavery, a photograph was taken in Charleston, South Carolina, that would remain hidden for nearly 3 decades. When it finally emerged from a sealed attic in 1911, it revealed a truth so shocking that it forced historians to rewrite what they thought they knew about the period following abolition. The image appeared innocent enough. 2 white children, Thomas and Elizabeth Whitmore, seated on an ornate Victorian sofa, dressed in their finest clothes and holding their cherished toys. Standing beside them with a serene expression and dignified posture was a girl identified only as Claire. For decades, those who saw the photograph assumed she was simply the daughter of the family's housekeeper, a charitable inclusion in a family portrait. But documents discovered in 1911 revealed something far more disturbing. Claire had been born into slavery, and despite the official abolition 17 years earlier, she was still living under the complete control of the family that had once owned her mother. The photograph, found in a trunk sealed away in the Whitmore family attic, became a symbol of an era when freedom was proclaimed from podiums and written into law, but rarely granted in practice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to uncover more hidden stories from American history that challenge everything we thought we knew. Today, we're diving deep into the story behind this haunting image. A story of Claire, a girl who should have been free, but whose reality was far more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. This is a story that reveals the ugly truth about what freedom really meant in post-Civil War America, and how the end of slavery was often just the beginning of new forms of bondage. Charleston, South Carolina, October 15, 1882. The morning air carried the familiar scent of salt from the harbor, mixed with the sweet fragrance of late-blooming jasmine that climbed the wrought-iron gates of the grand homes on Meeting Street. The cobblestone streets echoed with the rhythmic clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages as Charleston's elite went about their morning routines, maintaining the facade of genteel Southern society that had somehow survived the devastation of war and Reconstruction. Inside the imposing 3-story mansion at 247 Meeting Street, the Whitmore family was preparing for what they considered a momentous occasion. Margaret Whitmore, a woman of 42, whose steel-grey eyes reflected both the privilege of her birth and the hardness that 17 years of post-war adaptation had carved into her character, stood in the grand parlor directing the arrangement of furniture with the precision of a military commander. "Move that chair 3 inches to the left, Samuel," she instructed the elderly black man who had been with the family since before the war. "The light must fall perfectly across the children's faces. Mr. Hayes is the finest photographer in Charleston, and I will not have him think we are anything less than meticulous in our preparations." Samuel nodded silently, his weathered hands adjusting the ornate Victorian chair with practiced care. At 68, he had learned long ago that survival meant anticipating Mrs. Whitmore's wishes before she voiced them, and never under any circumstances offering suggestions or opinions unless directly asked, which was never. The parlor itself was a testament to the Whitmore family's determination to maintain their pre-war status despite the economic upheavals that had devastated much of the South. Rich burgundy wallpaper adorned the walls, punctuated by oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who had built their fortune on rice plantations and slave labor. Heavy velvet drapes framed tall windows that looked out onto a meticulously maintained garden where ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss created shadows that danced across manicured lawns. The furniture spoke of old money and older traditions. A mahogany dining table that could seat 16, imported from England in 1847. Crystal chandeliers that had somehow survived both the war and the lean years that followed, and the piece de résistance, an ornate sofa upholstered in cream silk that had been Mrs. Whitmore's wedding gift from her father, a man who had owned 3 plantations and over 200 enslaved people before the world changed forever. Edmund Hayes, the photographer, was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who had built a reputation among Charleston's elite for his ability to capture what they called the essence of Southern refinement. His equipment filled one corner of the parlor, a large wooden camera mounted on a brass tripod, glass plates carefully arranged in wooden boxes, and the various powders and chemicals needed to create the flash that would freeze this moment in time. "Mrs. Whitmore," Hayes said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he peered through the camera's viewfinder, "I believe we have the lighting just right. Shall I call for the children?" Margaret Whitmore smoothed her dark blue dress, a creation of silk and lace that had cost more than most Charleston families earned in 6 months, and nodded. "Samuel, please ask Miss Elizabeth and Master Thomas to come down, and tell Claire to join them." The casual way she mentioned Claire, as an afterthought almost, would later strike historians as particularly telling. In the social hierarchy of the Whitmore household, Claire occupied a space that defied easy categorization, existing in a liminal world between family and servant, between freedom and bondage, between the Old South and whatever was supposed to come next. Thomas Whitmore entered the parlor first, his 8-year-old frame dressed in a miniature version of adult male fashion, a dark wool suit with short pants, white shirt with a stiff collar, and polished leather shoes that clicked against the hardwood floors. In his small hands, he clutched a wooden toy horse, painted in realistic detail with a flowing mane and tail. The toy had been carved by his grandfather, Colonel James Whitmore, during the long winter of 1863, when the old man had been recovering from wounds received at Gettysburg. Thomas was a serious child, with the pale complexion and light brown hair that marked him as unmistakably a Whitmore. His blue eyes held an intelligence that his tutors praised, but also a certain distance that suggested he had already learned to see the world in terms of hierarchy and control. He had been taught from birth that he was destined for greatness, that the Whitmore name carried with it both privilege and responsibility, and that maintaining the family's position in Charleston society was not just important, but essential. 6-year-old Elizabeth followed her brother, her small hands carefully holding a porcelain doll that was nearly as tall as she was. The doll, imported from France and dressed in miniature finery that rivaled Elizabeth's own white lace dress, had been a gift for her last birthday. Elizabeth was a beautiful child with golden curls that her mother spent considerable time and money maintaining, and green eyes that sparkled with the confidence of someone who had never been told no about anything that truly mattered to her. Both children had been coached extensively on how to behave during the photography session. They were to sit still, look directly at the camera, and maintain the kind of dignified composure that befitted their station in life. They were not to fidget, speak unless spoken to, or do anything that might compromise the image their mother was determined to create. And then Claire entered the room. At 10 years old, Claire was taller than both Thomas and Elizabeth, with a presence that seemed to fill the space around her despite her quiet demeanor. Her skin was the color of café au lait, marking her as what Charleston society euphemistically called mixed race, a designation that carried with it a complex web of social, legal, and economic implications that would shape every aspect of her life. Claire's dress was beautiful, but clearly different from Elizabeth's. While Elizabeth wore pure white lace with intricate embroidery and silk ribbons, Claire's dress was a simple floral pattern in muted colors, well made and clean, but unmistakably marking her as separate from the Whitmore children. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her posture was perfectly straight, suggesting both natural dignity and careful training. But it was Claire's eyes that would later captivate anyone who saw the photograph. Dark brown and remarkably expressive, they seemed to hold depths of understanding that were startling in someone so young. There was intelligence there, certainly, but also something else, a kind of watchful awareness that suggested she understood far more about her situation than anyone realized. "Claire, you'll stand here," Mrs. Whitmore directed, indicating a spot slightly to the right of the sofa where Thomas and Elizabeth would sit. "Remember to keep your hands clasped in front of you and look directly at the camera. We want this to be a proper family portrait." The word family hung in the air with a weight that everyone in the room felt, but no one acknowledged. Claire nodded silently and took her position, her movements graceful and controlled. She had learned long ago that survival in the Whitmore household depended on being present but not prominent, visible but not vocal, useful but never demanding. As the photographer made his final adjustments, positioning Thomas and Elizabeth on the sofa and ensuring that the light fell correctly across their faces, the true complexity of this family portrait became apparent. Here were 3 children who shared the same roof, ate meals prepared in the same kitchen, and were educated by the same tutors. But the invisible lines that separated them were as real and impermeable as iron bars. Thomas and Elizabeth sat with the casual confidence of children who had never questioned their place in the world. They were Whitmores, and that name opened doors, commanded respect, and guaranteed a future filled with opportunities. They would attend the finest schools, marry into other prominent families, and inherit not just money and property, but social position and political influence. Claire stood with the careful composure of someone who understood that her very presence in this photograph was a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. She was in the picture but not of it, included but not equal, visible but not valued in the same way as the children seated before her. "Everyone ready?" Hayes asked, his hand poised over the camera's shutter mechanism. "Remember, you must remain perfectly still for several seconds after I remove the lens cap. Any movement will blur the image." Mrs. Whitmore took one final look at the arrangement, adjusting a fold in Elizabeth's dress and smoothing a strand of Thomas's hair. She glanced at Claire and nodded approvingly. The girl looked appropriately neat and well-behaved, exactly what was needed to demonstrate the family's benevolent treatment of their dependents. "Proceed, Mr. Hayes," she said, stepping back to observe from the side of the room. The photographer removed the lens cap, and for several long seconds the parlor was filled with absolute silence. The only sounds were the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the soft whisper of autumn wind through the oak trees outside. In that frozen moment, captured forever on glass and silver, 3 children looked directly into the camera lens. Thomas, serious and dignified, clutching his wooden horse. Elizabeth, beautiful and confident, holding her porcelain doll. And Claire, standing slightly apart, her hands clasped in front of her, her dark eyes meeting the camera's gaze with an intensity that would haunt everyone who saw the photograph. None of them could have known that this single image would one day become evidence in a case that would expose one of the most shameful secrets of the post-Civil War South. None of them could have imagined that Claire's story would eventually force historians to confront uncomfortable truths about what freedom really meant in 1882 America. The flash powder ignited with a bright burst of light, and the moment was preserved forever. But the story behind that moment, the story of Claire and the Whitmore family, was just beginning to unfold. To understand Claire's presence in that 1882 photograph, we must journey back to a time when the Whitmore plantations stretched across 3,000 acres of South Carolina lowcountry, when the family's wealth was built on the backs of over 200 enslaved human beings, and when the very idea that slavery might one day end seemed as impossible as the notion that the sun might rise in the west. The Whitmore plantation, established in 1798 by Thomas's great-grandfather, Jeremiah Whitmore, had been one of the most prosperous rice plantations in the Charleston area. The family's fortune was built on their mastery of the complex tidal rice cultivation system, a method of farming that required intimate knowledge of the coastal waterways and an enormous amount of backbreaking labor. It was on this plantation, in a small cabin behind the main house, that Sarah was born in 1845. Sarah's mother, Celia, had been purchased by Jeremiah Whitmore in 1820 from a slave market in Charleston, separated forever from her own family in Virginia. Celia had been chosen specifically for her experience in rice cultivation, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of enslaved Africans who had transformed the South Carolina lowcountry into one of the wealthiest regions in America. Sarah grew up in the shadow of the big house, learning from her mother the skills that would make her valuable to the Whitmore family. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, and the countless other tasks that kept a plantation household running smoothly. But Sarah was also beautiful, with light brown skin and features that caught the attention of James Whitmore, Jr., the plantation owner's eldest son. James Jr. was 22 in 1867 when he returned from the University of South Carolina, full of romantic notions about Southern honor and the natural order of society. He was also heir to one of the largest fortunes in South Carolina, destined to inherit not just vast wealth, but also the responsibility of maintaining the Whitmore family's position at the apex of Charleston society. The relationship that developed between James Jr. and Sarah was not uncommon on southern plantations, but it was always understood within the context of absolute power imbalance. Sarah had no choice in the matter. She was property, and her body, like her labor, belonged to the Whitmore family. When she became pregnant in early 1871, the child she carried was both James Jr.'s offspring and the Whitmore family's property. But history intervened before the child could be born into slavery. The Civil War had ended in 1865, and the 13th Amendment had officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. By the time Claire was born on March 15, 1872, she was technically free. But the reality of her situation was far more complicated. James Jr. had died at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, 8 years before Claire's birth, but not before leaving behind a letter acknowledging his relationship with Sarah and expressing his intention to provide for any children that might result from their union. The letter, written in the romantic language typical of young Southern gentlemen of the era, spoke of his deep affection for Sarah and his desire to ensure her welfare and that of our progeny. But James Jr., his noble intentions died with him on a Virginia battlefield, and the letter remained hidden in his personal effects, unknown to his family for decades. As far as the surviving Whitmores were concerned, Claire was simply the daughter of a former slave who had remained on the plantation after emancipation, and Sarah had indeed remained. Like thousands of formerly enslaved people across the South, she found herself free in name, but trapped by circumstances that made true freedom impossible. She had no money, no education, no family connections outside the plantation, and no skills that were valued in the broader economy. The Whitmore plantation was the only home she had ever known, and the Whitmore family was the only source of employment available to her. Margaret Whitmore, who had married James Jr.'s younger brother Robert in 1869, saw an opportunity in Sarah's situation. The plantation was struggling to adapt to free labor, and finding reliable domestic help was becoming increasingly difficult as formerly enslaved people left the area in search of better opportunities. Sarah was skilled, trustworthy, and had nowhere else to go. She was the perfect solution to Margaret's household management problems. The arrangement that developed was presented as mutually beneficial. Sarah would continue to live on the plantation, now as a paid employee rather than enslaved property. She would receive a small wage, room and board, and the security of continued employment. In return, she would manage the household staff, oversee the cooking and cleaning, and essentially run the domestic side of the plantation operation. But the reality was far more complex and exploitative than this arrangement suggested. Sarah's wages were minimal, barely enough to purchase basic necessities, and were often paid in credit at the plantation store rather than cash. Her room was the same cabin she had occupied as a slave, and her board consisted of the same basic rations that had been provided to enslaved workers. Most importantly, Sarah understood that her continued employment and her access to housing and food depended entirely on Margaret Whitmore's goodwill. She had no legal protections, no contract guaranteeing her wages or working conditions, and no recourse if she was dismissed. In practical terms, her situation differed little from slavery, except that she could not be sold to another family. When Claire was born, her status was even more ambiguous. She was legally free, but she was also completely dependent on the Whitmore family for her survival. Margaret Whitmore made it clear that Claire's presence was tolerated only as long as she proved useful and caused no trouble. The child would be fed and housed, but she would also be expected to work from the moment she was capable of performing simple tasks. As Claire grew, the true nature of her situation became increasingly apparent. She was not a member of the Whitmore family, despite sharing blood with Thomas and Elizabeth. She was not exactly a servant, since she received no wages and had no freedom to seek employment elsewhere. She existed in a grey area that had no legal definition, but was all too common in the post-war South. She was free but not free, included but not equal, valued but not loved. The Whitmore family's treatment of Claire reflected a broader pattern across the former Confederacy. While the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, it had not addressed the economic and social structures that had made slavery profitable. Plantation owners like the Whitmores found new ways to maintain control over black labor, using debt, intimidation, and economic dependency to create systems that were slavery in all but name. Sharecropping trapped millions of formerly enslaved people in cycles of debt that made it impossible to achieve true economic independence. Convict leasing allowed southern states to rent out prisoners, the vast majority of whom were black men arrested on trumped-up charges, to private companies for labor that was often more brutal than plantation slavery had been. And domestic arrangements like Claire's created a class of people who were technically free but practically bound to their former owners. Dr. Marcus Webb, a Charleston physician who was a frequent visitor to the Whitmore home, would later write in his diary about the contradictions he observed in Claire's situation. The child is remarkably intelligent, perhaps more so than the Whitmore children themselves. She reads voraciously, solves mathematical problems with ease, and displays a natural curiosity about the world that is both admirable and heartbreaking. Yet she carries herself with a resignation that no child should possess. She knows her place in this household, and she knows that place will never change, regardless of her abilities or accomplishments. Webb's observations were particularly significant because he was one of the few people outside the immediate family who had regular contact with Claire. Most visitors to the Whitmore home either never saw her or assumed she was simply a well-treated servant's child. The family was careful to maintain the fiction that Claire was Sarah's daughter and nothing more, a charitable case that demonstrated their Christian benevolence toward their former slaves. But maintaining this fiction required constant vigilance and careful management of Claire's interactions with the outside world. She was educated alongside Thomas and Elizabeth by private tutors, but she was instructed to remain silent about her lessons when visitors were present. She wore nice clothes for public appearances, but they were always clearly different from what the Whitmore children wore. She was included in family activities, but always in a subordinate role that reinforced her status as dependent rather than equal. The psychological impact of this treatment on Claire was profound. She grew up understanding that she was simultaneously valued and worthless, included and excluded, family and stranger. She learned to read the subtle signals that indicated when she should make herself visible and when she should disappear. She developed the kind of hypervigilance that comes from living in a situation where safety depends on correctly interpreting the moods and desires of those who hold absolute power over your life. Perhaps most cruelly, Claire was smart enough to understand exactly what was being done to her. She could see that Thomas and Elizabeth, who were no more intelligent or capable than she was, were being prepared for lives of privilege and opportunity while she was being groomed for a lifetime of service and dependency. She understood that the accident of her birth, being born to an enslaved mother rather than a free white woman, had determined her fate as surely as if it had been written in stone. Yet Claire also possessed a remarkable resilience and dignity that impressed everyone who met her. Despite the limitations placed on her life, she pursued learning with a passion that amazed her tutors. She read everything she could get her hands on, from classical literature to scientific treatises to political philosophy. She taught herself French and Latin, mastered advanced mathematics, and developed a sophisticated understanding of history and current events. This intellectual development created another layer of complexity in Claire's situation. The more educated she became, the more clearly she understood the injustice of her circumstances, but education also gave her hope. Hope that someday, somehow, she might find a way to escape the limitations that had been imposed on her life. The 1882 photograph captured Claire at a crucial moment in her development. At 10 years old, she was old enough to understand her situation, but still young enough to hope that it might change. The serious expression on her face in the photograph reflects not just the formal requirements of Victorian portraiture, but also the weight of knowledge that no child should have to carry. Standing beside Thomas and Elizabeth, Claire represented both the promise and the betrayal of emancipation. She was living proof that the end of slavery had not meant the end of racial oppression, and that freedom was often just another word for a different kind of bondage. As the years passed after that fateful photograph was taken, Claire's life in the Whitmore household became increasingly complex and psychologically demanding. The child who had stood so dignifiedly beside Thomas and Elizabeth in 1882 was growing into a young woman whose intelligence and capabilities far exceeded the narrow role that Charleston society had assigned to her. By 1885, when Claire was 13, the contradictions of her existence had become even more pronounced. She had grown tall and graceful, with features that clearly reflected her mixed heritage, but also possessed a natural elegance that drew attention wherever she went. Her education, conducted alongside Thomas and Elizabeth by a series of private tutors, had progressed to a level that would have been considered exceptional for any child, regardless of race. Professor William Hartwell, who served as the children's primary tutor from 1883 to 1887, would later write extensively about his experiences teaching in the Whitmore household. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1923, provide a unique window into Claire's intellectual development and the impossible situation in which she found herself. Claire possesses the most remarkable mind I have encountered in 30 years of teaching, Hartwell wrote in an entry dated September 15, 1885. Her grasp of Latin grammar surpasses that of students I have taught at the university level. She reads Virgil with an understanding of nuance and metaphor that astounds me. Yet I am instructed to ensure that her accomplishments never overshadow those of Master Thomas and Miss Elizabeth, a requirement that forces me to hold back a brilliant student in order to maintain social proprieties that I find increasingly difficult to stomach. The tutorial sessions took place in the Whitmore Library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that represented one of the finest private collections in Charleston. The room itself was a testament to the family's intellectual pretensions. First editions of Shakespeare and Milton, complete sets of classical authors in their original languages, scientific treatises, philosophical works, and historical texts that chronicled the rise and fall of civilizations. For Claire, the library represented both paradise and torture. She was surrounded by knowledge, but constantly reminded that her access to it was conditional and limited. She could read these books, but she could never own them. She could master their contents, but she could never use that knowledge to build a life of her own choosing. The daily routine of education in the Whitmore household followed a carefully orchestrated pattern designed to maintain social hierarchies while providing all three children with the kind of classical education that was expected of the Southern elite. Mornings began with Latin and Greek, followed by mathematics, then literature and composition. Afternoons were devoted to history, natural sciences, and what was euphemistically called moral philosophy, essentially lessons in how to behave according to the social expectations of their respective stations in life. Thomas, now 11, was being groomed to take over the family's business interests and social position. His education emphasized leadership, public speaking, and the kind of classical knowledge that would allow him to hold his own in conversations with other members of Charleston's elite. He was a capable student, but not an exceptional one, possessing the kind of steady intelligence that would serve him well in managing inherited wealth and social position. Elizabeth, at 9, was receiving the education considered appropriate for a young lady of her social class. She studied literature and languages, learned to paint and play the piano, and was instructed in the social graces that would help her make an advantageous marriage when the time came. She was bright and charming, with the kind of natural confidence that came from never having to question her place in the world. But it was Claire who truly excelled in every subject, often completing assignments that challenged Thomas and Elizabeth with an ease that both impressed and troubled Professor Hartwell. Her essays on historical topics demonstrated not just factual knowledge, but analytical thinking that was remarkably sophisticated for her age. Her mathematical abilities were so advanced that Hartwell had to seek out university-level textbooks to provide her with appropriate challenges. Perhaps most remarkably, Claire had taught herself to read and write in French and German by studying books in the Whitmore Library. When Hartwell discovered this, he was so impressed that he began providing her with additional instruction in these languages, despite having no authorization from Mrs. Whitmore to do so. "I cannot in good conscience limit this child's intellectual development," he wrote in his journal. "She has a hunger for knowledge that is both inspiring and heartbreaking. She devours every book I give her, asks questions that demonstrate genuine understanding, and makes connections between different subjects that show a truly first-rate mind. Yet I know that all of this education will ultimately serve only to make her more aware of the limitations that society has placed on her life." The social dynamics of these tutorial sessions were carefully managed by Mrs. Whitmore, who often observed from the doorway to ensure that proper hierarchies were maintained. Claire was expected to defer to Thomas in discussions, even when she clearly knew more about the subject at hand. She was required to help Elizabeth with her lessons, but in a way that made it appear that Elizabeth was simply receiving sisterly assistance rather than tutoring from someone more advanced. Most painfully, Claire was forbidden from expressing opinions or asking questions that might challenge the social order that kept her in her subordinate position. When the children studied the American Revolution, for example, Claire was not allowed to comment on the contradiction between the colonists' demands for freedom and their continued enslavement of Africans. When they read about ancient Rome, she could not point out the parallels between Roman slavery and the system that had recently ended in the American South. These restrictions created a constant tension in Claire's educational experience. She was encouraged to learn, but not to think critically about what she learned. She was praised for her intelligence, but warned never to display it in ways that might make others uncomfortable. She was given access to knowledge, but denied the freedom to use that knowledge to question or challenge the circumstances of her own life. The psychological impact of this educational paradox was profound. Claire began to develop what would later be recognized as a form of intellectual dissociation, the ability to engage fully with academic subjects while simultaneously suppressing her emotional and political responses to what she was learning. She became expert at presenting a calm, accepting exterior while her mind raced with questions and insights that she could never voice. Dr. Webb, the family physician who continued to visit the Whitmore home regularly, noticed changes in Claire's demeanor as she entered adolescence. The child has developed a kind of watchful stillness that is both impressive and concerning, he wrote in 1886. She observes everything, understands more than she should, and says less than she thinks. There is a quality of suppressed intensity about her that suggests great depths of feeling and thought that she has learned to keep carefully hidden. The social isolation that came with Claire's ambiguous position in the household became more pronounced as she grew older. She was too educated and refined to fit in with the other domestic workers, but she was barred by race and social convention from forming friendships with the children of other elite families. She existed in a social no-man's land, belonging fully to neither the world of the servants nor the world of the family. This isolation was particularly painful during social events at the Whitmore home. Charleston society in the 1880s was built around an elaborate network of social gatherings, dinner parties, garden parties, musical evenings, and formal receptions that allowed the elite to maintain their connections and reinforce their shared values. The Whitmore home was frequently the site of such gatherings, and Claire's role during these events was carefully choreographed to maintain social proprieties. She was expected to be present but invisible, helpful but unobtrusive. She might serve refreshments or assist with guests' wraps, but she was never introduced or included in conversations. She could listen to discussions of literature, politics, and current events, but she could never participate, no matter how much she might have to contribute. These social gatherings provided Claire with a unique education in the workings of Charleston's elite society. She observed the complex web of relationships, rivalries, and alliances that shaped the city's political and economic life. She listened to conversations about business deals, political appointments, and social scandals that gave her insights into how power really operated in the post-war South. But this knowledge came at a tremendous psychological cost. Claire was forced to watch as young women her own age, girls who were often less intelligent and less educated than she was, were celebrated, courted, and prepared for lives of privilege and influence. She saw how easily Thomas moved through this social world, how naturally he assumed the deference and respect that came with his position as a Whitmore heir. The contrast between Claire's intellectual capabilities and her social limitations became even more stark as she entered her teenage years. By 1888, when she was 16, she was reading works of philosophy and political theory that challenged many of the assumptions underlying Southern society. She had discovered the writings of Frederick Douglass, whose autobiography had somehow found its way into the Whitmore Library, and she had read accounts of the abolitionist movement that opened her eyes to different ways of thinking about race and freedom. But Claire was also smart enough to understand that expressing any interest in such ideas would be dangerous. The post-Reconstruction South was becoming increasingly hostile to any challenges to white supremacy, and even the limited freedoms that she enjoyed in the Whitmore household could be revoked if she was perceived as a threat to the social order. The year 1888 also brought changes to the Whitmore family that would have profound implications for Claire's future. Thomas, now 16, was preparing to leave for college, and there was talk of sending him to the University of Virginia, or perhaps even to Harvard. Elizabeth, at 14, was beginning to receive attention from the sons of other prominent Charleston families, and Mrs. Whitmore was already planning the social debut that would formally introduce her daughter to society. These developments forced Claire to confront the reality that her childhood companions were moving toward futures that would take them far away from the world they had shared. Thomas would go to university, then return to take his place in Charleston society as a businessman and civic leader. Elizabeth would marry well and become the mistress of her own grand home, with her own staff of servants to manage. But what future awaited Claire? At 16, she was more educated than most college graduates, more refined than many society ladies, and more intelligent than most of the young men who came calling on Elizabeth. Yet her options were severely limited by the circumstances of her birth and the social conventions of her time. Mrs. Whitmore had made it clear that Claire would always have a place in the household, but that place would be as a domestic worker, not as a family member. She might eventually be promoted to housekeeper or personal maid, positions that would provide security but no real independence. She might be allowed to marry, but only to another domestic worker or laborer, and any children she had would face the same limitations that constrained her own life. The photograph taken in 1882, when Claire was 10 years old, had captured her at a moment when the future still seemed open to possibility. But by 1888, the weight of accumulated experience had taught her that the dignified pose she had struck in that image was not just a momentary requirement of Victorian portraiture. It was a way of life that she would be expected to maintain forever. The girl who had stood so proudly beside Thomas and Elizabeth was becoming a young woman who understood that her intelligence, her education, and her capabilities would never be enough to overcome the barriers that society had erected around her life. She was trapped not by chains or laws, but by something far more insidious. A system of social expectations and economic dependencies that made freedom a theoretical concept rather than a practical reality. Yet Claire's spirit remained unbroken. In the privacy of her small room in the servants' quarters, she continued to read and study, to dream and plan, to hope that somehow, someday, she might find a way to use her gifts to create a different kind of life. The photograph from 1882 had captured not just her image, but her essence, the dignity, intelligence, and quiet strength that would sustain her through the challenges that lay ahead. The photograph that had captured Claire, Thomas, and Elizabeth in 1882 remained hidden in the Whitmore family attic for 29 years, locked away in a cedar trunk, along with other family memorabilia that Margaret Whitmore had deemed too sensitive for public viewing. It might have remained there forever, its secrets buried with the generation that created them, if not for a series of events that began with Thomas Whitmore's unexpected death in the winter of 1911. Thomas had grown into the man his family had always expected him to become. After graduating from the University of Virginia in 1894, he had returned to Charleston to take over the family's business interests, which had evolved from rice planting to real estate development and banking. He had married well. His wife, Catherine, was the daughter of a prominent Savannah family and had established himself as a respected member of Charleston's business and social elite. But Thomas had also carried with him, throughout his adult life, a burden of guilt and shame that grew heavier with each passing year. The boy who had sat so confidently beside Claire in that 1882 photograph had become a man who could never forget the injustices he had witnessed and, through his silence, helped to perpetuate. In the months before his death, Thomas had begun to speak more frequently about the past, often in ways that puzzled and concerned his family. He would make cryptic references to debts that needed to be paid and truths that needed to be told. His wife attributed these comments to the stress of business pressures and the declining health that would eventually claim his life at the age of 37. But Thomas's son, Robert, who was 22 in 1911 and had recently graduated from Harvard Law School, sensed that his father's comments reflected something deeper than business concerns or physical illness. Robert had always been struck by his father's unusual sensitivity to issues of racial justice, unusual, that is, for a white Southern gentleman of his generation. Thomas had quietly supported efforts to improve educational opportunities for black children in Charleston, had insisted on paying fair wages to his employees regardless of race, and had spoken out against the increasingly harsh Jim Crow laws that were being enacted across the South. When Thomas died suddenly of a heart attack in February 1911, Robert was tasked with settling his father's estate and going through his personal effects. It was during this process that he discovered the locked cedar trunk in the attic, along with a letter addressed to him in his father's handwriting. The letter, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death, contained instructions that would change everything Robert thought he knew about his family's history. "My dear son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have passed from this world without finding the courage to tell you the truth that has haunted me for nearly 30 years. In the trunk beside this letter, you will find documents and photographs that reveal a shameful chapter in our family's history, a chapter that I have been too cowardly to confront during my lifetime, but which I pray you will have the strength to address after my death." With trembling hands, Robert opened the trunk and discovered a collection of items that would force him to completely reassess everything he had been taught about his family's past. There were legal documents, correspondence, financial records, and most shocking of all, the 1882 photograph of his father as a child, sitting beside his Aunt Elizabeth and a black girl who had been identified to Robert throughout his childhood as simply the daughter of our former housekeeper. But the trunk also contained other documents that told a very different story. There was a birth certificate for Claire, listing her mother as Sarah and her father as James Whitmore Jr., Robert's uncle who had died in the Civil War. There were letters from James Jr. to Sarah, expressing his love for her and his intention to provide for their child. There were financial records showing payments made to Sarah over the years, not as wages for domestic work, but as what the documents called support for the natural daughter of James Whitmore Jr. Most damning of all was a confession letter that Thomas had written but never sent, detailing the true nature of Claire's relationship to the family and the cruel deception that had been maintained for decades. "Claire was our sister in blood," Thomas had written, "the daughter of our Uncle James and his beloved Sarah. She shared our bloodline, our intelligence, and our potential, but we denied her the love, recognition, and opportunities that should have been her birthright. We allowed her to be treated as a servant in her own family's home, to be educated but never acknowledged, to be valued but never loved as she deserved." The letter went on to describe Claire's exceptional intelligence, her dignity in the face of impossible circumstances, and the family's systematic efforts to suppress any recognition of her true parentage. Thomas wrote about the psychological torture of watching Claire excel in her studies, while knowing that her achievements would never be acknowledged or rewarded. He described the pain of seeing her treated as a subordinate by visitors who would have been honored to meet her if they had known her true identity. "She was the best of us," Thomas concluded, And we destroyed her chances for happiness because we were too cowardly to challenge the social conventions that made our comfort possible. I have spent my entire adult life trying to atone for this sin, but I know that nothing I have done can compensate for the injustice we inflicted upon her. Robert spent days going through the documents, piecing together the full story of Claire's life in the Whitmore household. He discovered that she had remained with the family until 1895, when she was 23 years old. The circumstances of her departure were unclear from the documents, but there were hints that she had finally found the courage to leave on her own terms. There was a brief note in Margaret Whitmore's handwriting, dated March 1895, that simply stated, "Claire departed this morning, left no forwarding address. Sarah is distraught." There were also financial records showing that a significant sum of money, equivalent to several years' wages for a domestic worker, had been withdrawn from the family accounts around the same time. Robert began to suspect that his father had secretly provided Claire with the means to escape, perhaps finally finding the courage to act on the guilt that had tormented him for so long. But if so, Thomas had never revealed what had become of her, or whether his assistance had enabled her to build the kind of life that her intelligence and capabilities deserved. Determined to learn more about Claire's fate and to make amends for his family's treatment of her, Robert hired private investigators to search for any trace of her after 1895. He placed advertisements in newspapers across the country, describing Claire and asking for any information about her whereabouts. He contacted schools, churches, and social organizations that might have records of a highly educated black woman who had arrived in their communities in the mid-1890s. The search proved frustrating and largely fruitless. The investigators found several women who matched Claire's general description, but none who could be definitively identified as the Claire from the Whitmore household. The trail seemed to have gone completely cold, as if she had simply vanished from the historical record. But the search did reveal something important about the broader context of Claire's story. Robert discovered that there were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of similar cases across the post-war South, mixed-race children who had been born into slavery or in the immediate aftermath of emancipation, who had been raised in white households but denied recognition or inheritance rights, and who had eventually disappeared into the anonymity of a society that preferred not to acknowledge their existence. Dr. Angela Morrison, a historian at the University of South Carolina who became interested in Claire's story after Robert contacted the university for assistance, would later write, "Claire's case represents a hidden chapter in American history, the story of children who were caught between two worlds, who possessed the education and refinement of the white elite, but were denied access to the opportunities that should have accompanied such advantages. These children often possessed remarkable talents and capabilities, but they were forced to navigate a society that had no place for them." Robert's investigation also revealed the broader historical context that had shaped Claire's life. The 1880s and 1890s had been a period of increasing racial oppression in the South, as the promises of Reconstruction were systematically betrayed through the implementation of Jim Crow laws, the disenfranchisement of black voters, and the rise of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan that used violence and intimidation to maintain white supremacy. For someone in Claire's position, educated, refined, and visibly of mixed race, this period would have been particularly dangerous. She would have been too prominent to blend into the general population of black domestic workers, but too obviously non-white to pass as a member of white society. Her very existence challenged the racial categories that post-Reconstruction society was desperately trying to enforce. In 1913, 2 years after discovering the truth about Claire, Robert made a decision that shocked Charleston society. He donated the 1882 photograph and all the related documents to the Charleston Historical Society, along with a detailed account of his family's treatment of Claire and a public apology for the injustices she had suffered. The donation created a sensation in Charleston's social circles. Many of Robert's friends and business associates urged him to reconsider, arguing that exposing such family secrets would damage the Whitmore name and accomplish nothing positive. But Robert was determined to ensure that Claire's story would not be forgotten, even if he could not locate her to make direct amends. "My family profited from a system of oppression that denied basic human dignity to people like Claire," Robert wrote in a statement that was published in the Charleston News and Courier. "We cannot undo the harm that was done, but we can ensure that the truth is told and that Claire's intelligence, dignity, and strength are finally acknowledged and honored." The Charleston Historical Society initially hesitated to accept the donation, fearing that it might be too controversial for public display. But Dr. Morrison and other historians argued that Claire's story was too important to suppress, and in 1915, the photograph and documents became part of a groundbreaking exhibition titled Hidden Lives: The Untold Stories of Reconstruction. Nay, the exhibition drew visitors from across the country and sparked a broader conversation about the hidden histories of the post-Civil War period. Scholars began to search for similar cases, and gradually a more complete picture emerged of the complex ways that racial oppression had operated in the decades following emancipation. Claire's photograph became one of the most powerful images in the exhibition. Visitors were struck by the dignity and intelligence visible in her young face, and by the tragic irony of her position in the family portrait. Here was a child who clearly belonged with the family, yet was forever marked as separate and subordinate. The photograph also became a symbol of the broader failure of Reconstruction to deliver on its promises of equality and justice. Claire's story illustrated how the end of slavery had not meant the end of racial oppression, but had simply led to the creation of new forms of bondage that were often more psychologically cruel than the old system had been. In the decades that followed, historians would use Claire's story to illustrate the complex realities of race relations in the post-war South. Her case became a standard example in textbooks and scholarly articles about the period, helping to educate new generations about the gap between the legal promises of emancipation and the lived realities of formerly enslaved people and their children. But perhaps the most important legacy of Claire's story was the way it humanized the broader historical narrative. Instead of abstract discussions of laws and policies, Claire's photograph put a human face on the injustices of the post-Reconstruction era. Her dignified presence in that 1882 image served as a powerful reminder that behind every historical statistic was a real person with hopes, dreams, and capabilities that had been crushed by systems of oppression. Dr. Morrison, who spent much of her career studying cases like Claire's, would later write, "Claire's photograph forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history. It reminds us that the promise of freedom was often betrayed, that intelligence and dignity were not enough to overcome the barriers erected by racial prejudice, and that countless talented individuals were denied the opportunities they deserved simply because of the circumstances of their birth." The search for Claire herself continued sporadically for decades, but she was never found. Some historians speculated that she had managed to pass as white in a northern city, using her education and refinement to create a new identity for herself. Others suggested that she had become a teacher or social worker in a black community, using her exceptional education to help others who had been denied opportunities. But regardless of what became of Claire after she left the Whitmore household in 1895, her legacy was secure. The photograph that had been intended to showcase the prosperity and respectability of a Charleston family had instead become evidence of one of the most shameful aspects of American history: And the girl, who had been denied recognition and love during her lifetime, had finally received the acknowledgement she deserved, even if it came too late for her to benefit from it personally. Today, Claire's photograph hangs in the Charleston Museum, where it continues to educate visitors about the complex realities of the post-Civil War period. School groups study her image as part of their lessons about Reconstruction and its aftermath. Scholars continue to research cases like hers, gradually building a more complete understanding of how racial oppression operated in the decades following emancipation. But perhaps most importantly, Claire's story serves as a reminder that history is not just about the famous and powerful, but about ordinary people whose lives were shaped by the forces of their time. Her dignified presence in that 1882 photograph ensures that her story will never be forgotten and that the injustices she suffered will continue to educate and inspire future generations. The girl who was denied her rightful place in the Whitmore family has finally found her place in American history, not as a footnote or curiosity, but as a powerful symbol of both the failures and the possibilities of the American dream. Her story reminds us that freedom is not just a legal concept, but a lived reality that must be constantly defended and expanded. And her image, captured in that moment in 1882, continues to challenge us to confront the uncomfortable truths about our past and to work toward a more just and equitable future. In the end, Claire's greatest victory was not in escaping the Whitmore household or in finding personal happiness, though we can hope she achieved both. Her greatest victory was in the simple act of surviving with her dignity intact, of maintaining her humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization, and of leaving behind an image that would eventually force the world to confront the truth about her story and the stories of countless others like her. The photograph that was meant to preserve the image of a perfect Charleston family instead became evidence of the imperfections and injustices that lay at the heart of American society. And the girl who was supposed to remain invisible and silent has finally found her voice, speaking across the decades to remind us that every person deserves recognition, respect, and the opportunity to fulfill their potential, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. Claire's story is ultimately a story about the power of truth to emerge from even the deepest shadows, and about the importance of bearing witness to injustice, even when that witness comes too late to change the outcome. Her photograph stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and as a challenge to each generation to do better than the one that came before. As we reach the end of Claire's story, we're left with more questions than answers, and perhaps that's as it should be. The 1882 photograph that started our journey continues to hang in the Charleston Museum, where thousands of visitors each year pause to study the faces of 3 children frozen in time. But it's Claire's face that draws the longest looks, her eyes that seem to follow viewers as they move through the exhibition. What happened to Claire after she left the Whitmore household in 1895? Did she find the freedom and recognition that had been denied to her for so long? Did she use her remarkable education to build a life of purpose and meaning? Did she ever marry, have children of her own, pass on the strength and dignity that had sustained her through so many years of injustice? We may never know the answers to these questions. Claire vanished from the historical record as completely as if she had never existed.